Well, I'm part of the Remote Sensing Research Center, and in that center, oh, that's good. In that Remote Sensing Research Center, we have different projects where I'm focused and running basically all the coral reef and seagrass remote sensing projects. Part of that is trying to develop approaches that can be applied and develop products that can be used for taking care of the marine environment and specifically coral reef and seagrass better. Those approaches focus on in generally on mapping approaches using remote sensing, but also on field approaches to get calibration and validation data. So yeah, like Keith already said, the microphone's on mute. During the webinar, I see if I'll stop if there's any specific questions. But you can, at the end, there will be some time for question, and you can email me as well if you want to. So I will talk first a bit about coral reefs and marine remote sensing specifically, so that you have a good understanding of the background. And then I'll build up the talk going from a single coral reef to time series analysis of reefs and seagrass habitats, and then to large reef systems up to mapping the Great Barrier Reef. What I'm teaching at the university, advanced remote sensing or Earth observation, and part of that, one of the things I always teach the people involved, the students, is that whatever you're mapping or trying to monitor, you have to understand it. On the moment you understand it and have been in that environment, then you will be much better able to map it. So hence I will give a short introduction on coral reefs also, so that you at least have some background on that part. So coral reefs are basically enormous big apartment buildings, and in each little room there's what's called a coral polyp living, and you see the little drawing in the top. In the coral polyp is an animal, but it lives in symbiosis with tiny algae called zooxanthellae. They are mutually beneficial to each other, and hence they are able to build these beautiful reef systems, and took years and 10,000 or 100,000 of years to build them. These reefs characterize themselves by different geomorphic zonation, where you can see the coral cay at the on one end and the deep water at the other end. And in between you can see lagoons, the reef flat, the reef crest, and the reef slope. They together make up the reef, where on the crest and the slope you usually see most of the live coral present on a coral reef. In all the areas, of course, you see an enormous amount of animal life. These coral reefs you find in different ways. You find what's called fringing reef or lagoonal reef or coral cay reef, but you also find barrier reef. Each of these reefs has its own characteristic, how it's formed over time, but all have in common that that corals are living on them and that they take care that they're growing. These systems are so big that you can see them from space, and the Great Barrier Reef is the most well-known one, usually as one of the biggest reefs in the world, or the biggest reef in the world. Now, looking at the world's oceans, it covers 70% of the Earth's surface, and 1% of that Earth's surface is actually captured by coral reef. But 25% of all marine species has some way of being reliant on the coral reefs. So hence the importance of protecting these reefs and taking care that they can be managed well is very, very important. In these coral reefs, the value of these reefs is that they form coastal protection. For if those reefs would not be there, that would be a nightmare for insurance companies, because they form a natural barrier. In the same way, they are a food resource because of the amount of fish and invertebrates like sea cucumbers are in there. It has an enormous high biodiversity, and for many people, it's an area where they come and visit. Now, sadly, over the years, these areas have been threatened. Coral bleaching is possibly the most well-known. And although people are saying that the Great Barrier Reef is dead, I can promise you it's not dead at all. But yes, it's been impacted by coral bleaching. And that's the process where basically by heating of the water, the zooxanthellae leaves the corals and makes the coral look white for a short bit, for 4 or 5 weeks, and then it will or die or regain its energy. Cyclones are very destructive, and of course coastal development as well. And yeah, all these values and these threats need to be monitored. Now, obviously, they cover large areas, and anything which covers large areas or which are remote sensing seems to be a very good tool to look at it. Here is a little schematic diagram of Earth observation, what we often show in our classes and teach people about, where you see the pathway of the sunlight going from the Earth, from the sun through the atmosphere to the Earth's surface. And in that process, the light is broken, absorbed and scattered before it hits back into the satellite. Now, for a lot of people, they're used to work with these images on a daily basis, and eCognition is probably mostly used from an Earth observation point of view for terrestrial applications. Now, if you get in the marine environment, you get some more challenges, because that light penetrates the water column to a certain extent, because some of that light is absorbed and some of it is scattered. And red light, for instance, usually doesn't penetrate the water, or near infrared red light doesn't come deep at all. As a result, you really have to deal with the visible light that comes back from the surface. Depending on the water column composition, if it's very clear or turbid water, the light is influenced, and the amount of light coming back into the sensor is influenced as well. Now, that would be in a steady state like this, schematic figure, very good. However, there are some challenging, because the water surface is moving because of tide, so it's going up and down. So in some cases, the water is deeper, and then it can be shallower over the same area. Then there are waves caused by wind, which causes a rippling effect. And anybody who's been out on a boat knows that when there's a lot of ripples, then it's hard to look in the water. And you get sun glint effect. And then there's currents, and currents are moving around the different types of water. Sorry, I had to take a sip. So these different types of water, they have different characteristics in its composition, and sometimes very clear and sometimes turbid. And for instance, after a rain event, you can expect turbid water coming into a system, covering up the different benthic plants like seagrasses or algae, as shown here. Now, in generally, when people come to me and ask can we map seagrass, or can we map my coral reef, then my first question is, if you go out with a boat and you look overboard, can you differentiate the features that you see on the bottom? And if they say they can't, then I usually have to say, well, there's a big chance you cannot do that from space as well. So you have to think, and that's our challenge also with using remote sensing analysis to get information about this environment, to basically map, for instance, where the coral reefs are or the seagrass habitats. So initially with my PhD work, I'm mostly focused on using pixel-based approaches, where I looked at the different signatures from characteristic features that make up the coral reef, and then try to use that to train use a classifier to train and develop a map out of it. Other approaches I used the modeling, where you basically create a depth map of an environment by finding a relationship between the pixel values and the biophysical property. Now, in both these cases, on the moment the water column changes in depth, or because of tides, or in composition because of water quality, it will be the spectral signatures or the spectral values changes as well. As a result, you need to find other approaches to take into account the composition of the water column. Now, there's several approaches, physics-based approaches, where you basically resolve for the water column and you try to understand the whole water column and correct for that. But the approaches that I started to apply over the years is object-based image analysis, where we look at segmentation of the environment and then the labeling of these segments, using not only the texture and the color, but also the location and the biology, which is the last three components, the texture, location, and the biology, are main drivers of what I'm presenting now. And hence, it is also one of the reasons why it's so important for me to work with marine biologists and have a good understanding of what the coral reef is composed of. So, yeah, it works better in the future. So, what scales are we mapping coral reefs? So, at different levels. So, this is a scale we often use. Karen Joyce at the University of the James Cook University initiated this graph, I would say, where you basically can see the different scales, feature scales you're looking at, and the different reef levels, going from reef systems to biotope. Now, what's a reef system? A reef system is basically, you could say, a group of reefs spread out over an area. And an example is shown from an area on the Great Barrier Reef. Reef type, you can say, well, here's zoomed in Fiji, where you see a part of a fringing reef along the coast, where the water is usually a bit more turbid. Then lagoonal reefs in the middle. And then on the edge, you see the barrier reef on the bottom part that protects the reefs behind it. Now, each of these different reef types, you could divide up in different geomorphic zones, where you have on the top the deep water, and on the bottom of this figure, you would have the shallow water, the lagoonal water. And in the middle, you have what's called the reef crest and reef flat area, where most of the coral, live coral, you would find along the slopes in the reef crest area. Within each of those areas, those zones, you can find what we call benthic community, the life composition of different plant and animal life, such as algae or corals. And then within each of those benthic communities, you could even look further to patches of only the coral, the seagrasses, the sand, the rubble, and the rock. Together, all these features make up this environment. So what about single reefs? How can we look at those? So first, we'll talk you through some of the work we've done on single reefs. And here's an example on the right of Heron Reef. This is located about 300 to 400 kilometers north from Brisbane. It's about 11 by 6 kilometers in size. It's a typical platform reef, and you can see that for each of the different mapping approaches we could apply an approach. And like I said, in here it's not based on the color of the pixel, but we also look at the texture and the neighborhood relationship. So as an example, seagrass needs soft bottom. So on the moment you know it's hard bottom, you know that you don't have to look for seagrass. Now, usually the darker features on the reef are the harder bottoms, where the softer bottoms are usually the brighter features. Here's an example of the different levels of detail of a pen sharpened image that we used to create first a geomorphic map where you see the different zones, then a benthic community map, and the last part you see a patch map where the colors represents the different zones, the benthic communities or the patches. The approach that we have been applying since 2006 is a hierarchical classification scheme, basically, where we first divide the image that we have up into deep water and land, and then the remaining area is shallow water. Now, initially we didn't have depth, so we used ratios. We created ratios in eCognition between blue and the red band or blue and the green band, depending on what worked best, to extract the deep water. Or we used the NDVI ratio to extract land features. And then the remaining area, the unclassified area, was labeled as shallow reef. Then the segmentations, we used multispectral segmentation on those approaches, where the color and scale factor were constant. Where the color and shape factor were constant, but we changed the parameter setting depending on the geomorphic zone size. This is a visual adjustment of that parameter. Then once we have the shallow reef, we try to differentiate between the different reef types, for instance, rocky reef or carbonate reefs. And then within each of those reef types, we look at atoll, barrier, lagoonal. And that's basically related to the position where it is. So for instance, fringing reefs, they are neighboring land. So you use neighborhood relationships to get those out. Then within each each reef type, we look at geomorphic zones. And in these geomorphic zones, we also have a relationship. So we know that the reef crest is the shallowest part of the reef. We know that it's neighboring the slope. So if we have depth, we can actually pull out that area. Or if we use ratios, we can start doing that. And it's the same with the different other parameters. Now, within each of those zones, we can look at different types of benthic community. And this can be done in several ways. A way we apply, which I show later, is that we use supervised classification, or we use brightness characteristics and neighborhood relationships to point them out within each individual zone. To do supervised classification, specifically on the benthic, we need to get information of the seabed. How do we do that? We use georeferenced photo transects to collect data in the water, where a diver or snorkeler swims over the bottom and takes photos, and they're linked with the GPS. A GPS doesn't work underwater, not only because it's not always waterproof, but also because the signal doesn't come through. Now we get photos, these are georeferenced, and each photo is analyzed using a machine learning approach in CoralNet, and gives us an idea of the composition of the reef, and that we can use to map the reef. So we did that on individual reefs, and these examples that I gave previously, we started off with Heron, where the yellow dots in all the images represents the location of the transects, where we collected field data. So obviously we would like to go to more places, but yeah, time is limited. What you see in the top image, which is called Heron Reef, the A image, that would take us around 4 or 5 days to collect that data, and it would take us about, currently with the machine learning, probably 4 or 5 days to analyze the data, and we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 photos. The other reefs are in Palau and in Fiji, and you see they have other compositions, and you see turbid, other water clarities as well. But using the approaches I just mentioned, we were able to create rule sets that differentiate the different zones based on their brightness or the neighborhood relationship, or ratios that help define deep water or shallow water. And that gives us what we call the geomorphic zonation of a reef, using multi-resolution segmentation. Now, within each of these zones, we looked into detail, and zone by zone, within each of these geomorphic zone by zone, we analyzed them to look at benthic composition. And we could do that to a high level of detail because we had so much field data for it. And also there we use brightness, neighborhood relationships, and also difference to closest neighbor to pull out features that are characteristic. As you will notice, at several places I put the publication where you can read more about this work for that specific topic. Now, this is about a single reef. Let's say if you now would look at more reefs, then here's an example of a seagrass habitat in Moreton Bay, Australia. It's on the east coast. It's close to the university. I don't know if you see the mouse moving, but it's basically on the tip of, if you look at the little map of Australia, a bit north of that, that's where I'm at the moment. In that area, you can find seagrasses, and seagrasses are important for dugongs and the manatee, for instance, and turtles, but also form a food resource and a coastal protection. The work I'm presenting now is for the area called the Eastern Banks. Mitch did work there, Mitch Lyons, where he looked at the time series of Landsat imagery and developed a rule set for every of the images that he collected to look at the composition of the seagrass on the banks, the seagrass cover in that basis. Also there he used first the hierarchical approach, and then for getting the main areas out and getting rid of land and deep water, but also at the exposed areas. And that resulted in this time series. So he and I worked together on seagrass species mapping as well, where we collected field data through the photo transects, and we're able to get species, cover, and biomass for different areas on the image. We collected at the same time satellite imagery and the field data. We used an approach where we differentiated land and water, and within the water we looked at submerged and exposed areas, and of course turbid and deep, but those areas we couldn't map the seagrass. There we used the nearest neighbor classifier on the objects, where the objects were trained with the field data. We did it for species and we did it for cover. And then we had part of the field data that we could use for validation. These two maps were then used as an input together with field data to find a relationship to basically create seagrass biomass maps as well. So that resulted in two types of maps, species and cover, that directly come from object-based analysis. And then using those products, we could also make a map looking at the biomass, where for every object, a relationship was found between the species and the cover present to calculate the biomass. We did it for a whole time series of 9, and I think by now we've done 12 images throughout this area, and this provided local scientists and managers with a good understanding of the variation that is in that area in seagrass. Now, for Heron, we're fortunate. Heron Reef, on again, it's about 300-400 kilometers north. We have a similar data set. However, it's another environment. It's a coral reef environment with usually clearer water. Since 2001, on an annual basis, we've been collecting photo transects, around 4,000 photos per year, and high-set spatial high spatial resolution imagery. So a lot of data collected, and just recently we were able to publish, or we published an approach that is based on the seagrass work in the Moreton Bay that we now apply to coral reef work. We just recently published the first maps out of that, and we're now in the process to reanalyze all the field data and link that up with the imagery. And again, this is based on a supervised classification of the reef. So these are all situations where it's reasonably small areas and where the reefs are located, I say, within one image scene usually. Now this is maybe a point where if there's any questions, then I'm happy to answer some questions and go from there. Keith?
Hey, Chris. One question is that at the moment we see examples of sort of isolated reefs. Has any of this been applied to, say, the larger reef systems? Maybe even the Great Barrier Reef in its entirety. Are there any plans to do extended mapping of larger reef systems based on this type of methodology?
That's the next part of the presentation, so I will go in detail in that as well.
Okay, great. Now we have a few questions popping in here as you say that. One question is, what images have you used for seagrass mapping?
Oh, it's we use Landsat, Sentinel, QuickBird, ZY3, WorldView 2, WorldView 3, so a whole series of, and Cassie also, so airborne hyperspectral.
Okay, great, excellent. And one other question that's popped up here regarding the accuracy of your mapping that you've been doing is, considering the accuracy of these maps, how do you account for a photo, which is just a single point? How do you take that that point and validate it to, say, an image object? Is that something that you consider?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's an enormous challenge for us, because one thing what we start to realize that we think that our accuracies are better, but because of the georeferencing challenges between these detailed photo transects and the objects, that errors occur due to that. What we currently do is that we basically select a number of points, we do that randomly, that fall within the segments, and assess based on the photos of the field data, the analyzed field data, if they agree with what the label is of the segment. But I go into that in a bit more detail later on. I show some examples.
Okay, great. Then I'll let you continue at the moment. There are a few more questions, but I think some of them might be answered in the subsequent slides that you have. So if not, then I'll interrupt again, and we can field a few more of the questions as they come up.
Okay, good. So yeah, like some of the viewers already noticed, asked, and as you see from the green box, the next step is from how about large reefs? If you look at large reefs, then there is the challenge is that, and here you see example of 300 square kilometers of reef in Fiji. The challenges of that area that it's a variety of different reef types, so fringing reefs and barrier reef, lagoon reefs, atoll type reefs, a variety of water quality. If you look good, then you see in the northern part of the image, you see some brown water, whereas on the southern part of the image, the atoll area, you see very clear water. So there's a variety of water quality. Next to it could be tidal difference, and even over this large distance, there could also be differences in surface surface roughness of the water. So part of that, the chance of getting a high resolution image of this area in one go a seamless image is very small. Now I can say that it's only increasing with the number of satellite images that have been satellite sensors that have been going up in space, and specifically the CubeSat, like the Planet Dove imagery. But you quickly are dealing with a variety of images. These images can, till not so long, vary in tidal range at the moment of collection, in tidal range, water clarity, water roughness, cloud cover. And you can see that already from the mosaic that I show, that there's a variety of images. And you see the little bar, white bar under the scale bar between the two images. That's basically because we had no images. Another example of the challenges of this is that on a lot of reefs, till not so long, there was almost no high-resolution images available for the complete reef due to the lack of coverage for it. Now, object-based analysis, because it not only looks at the color of the pixel, but also the texture and also the location, a particular location, you can actually work with this combination of images. And what you see here, the top image is an Iconos image. The middle image is a QuickBird image. And the bottom image is a Worldview 2 image, I believe, if I remember. So it's a variety of images with different pixel sizes. And I was very able to use it. So here's, for instance, another example from how we mapped it. This is of large reefs. So we mapped reefs in Fiji at different places, in Bikini Atoll, the Solomons, and the Philippines. And they were all reef systems between 300 and 600 square kilometers. On the image on the left, you see the yellow dots on the top image, or the satellite image of that reef system. It's the Great Barrier Reef in Fiji. And you see there's a heaps of field data collected. And actually a student asked me to map this reef. And I said, well, if you collect field data, I can probably map it. And that collaboration worked very well. Now, to do that, we applied that same hierarchical approach and with similar rule sets. But then for each type of reef, we use different rules, but still similar. Lots of field data, and as a result, we could come to a lot of benthic community detail for the map. We start to realize that it's an attribute-based principle, and I'll explain you in a sec what I mean with that. And also this work is published, so you can get it. Now the question was raised about the accuracy. So what you see here is the accuracy of the smaller reefs that we mapped, where orange is the geomorphic and red is the benthic. On the x-axis, you see the number of categories, and on the y-axis, the overall accuracy. So you see we got for geomorphic around 75% accuracy, and with 5 to 10 classes. And the benthic, we saw between, let's say, 50 and 75 accuracy. This was for the single reef where it's just one scene. If you look at the large reef system, you see that for the red ones, the benthic community, with a lot of variety in categories, we're still able to get this high level of accuracy. This is also due because of the large number of field data collected at the same time. Now that's of course a challenge because you can't go to every reef in the world and get that amount of field data. So you need to find other ways to do that. The dotted line is actually a representation of 8 studies where they used pixel-based approaches to map the benthic community. And this regression line shows that an increase in detail of present on the map, you lose accuracy. And it's pretty good to see that the benthic community for the large reef system still do pretty good. Now, I mentioned before that the attribute-based approach. This is with the work done with the Queensland government here, the state where I live. They developed a topology system of rules to create maps of the terrestrial part, but also of the habitat. And I try to use that same kind of rules, that topology, for every category that I mapped. So that it's really every category is based on a set of attributes. And you see the pixel-based and band ratios and neighborhood, where band ratios are usually used to look at water depth. Now, that works well, but since 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to work on larger reef systems, and the people asked already about that previously. And yes, these systems are, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef. Large areas, more reefs can't have the same amount of field data, so you need smarter rules and more robust rules. With the current development in satellite remote sensing and image analysis, one of the things people can do way better than before is get depth out of satellite imagery. And so there's several companies and organizations who provide it. We work with a company called EOMAP, and they have done a really good job in getting depth out of satellite imagery. On the moment you have depth, you actually can also determine slope, as you probably know if you work with digital elevation models. But what's also important, we can start to have a look at significant wave height, the wave characteristics. So if we have wind and a good depth model, we can calculate where the wave energy goes on a reef system. And that information helps with understanding how to map these different reefs. So yeah, we can have new rules to help make these more robust rules to make these systems. So as a result, we can label the rule sets not only to some kind of trial and error thing, but actually to literature values or to findings on reef work on where certain coral types grow or certain zonations are of the reef. Another approach which I started to use more is chessboard segmentation. Because of these rules, that worked very well in distinguishing different, specifically geomorphic zones. Now that gets me to the last part of the talk. It spends the last 10 minutes roughly on it. I'll focus more on the mapping part. But basically at this stage, this work is basically saying from, okay, how much coral habitat is there actually on the Great Barrier Reef? I mentioned already that coral requires light, temperature, water chemistry, a hard bottom, and wave energy to grow. And here you see some images around Heron Reef with 100% coral cover. We can go in the water and try to validate every area where we go and make a complete map out of it. But to do that for the whole Great Barrier Reef, that probably takes, for whole of Heron, that would take us 3 years to go to every single pixel. So that's not a good option. Especially knowing that the Great Barrier Reef consists of 3,000 reefs. It's the size of Italy and it's 2,300 kilometers long. The shortest distance to the reef is probably, of the outer part of the reef, is probably an hour by boat. And the furthest it's more like 4 to 5 hours if you sail straight from the shore. Now, the Great Barrier Reef is just valued as being $56 billion annually. Part of that is going also to global community also. Now, if you notice that this is a picture out of a report that came out, and you see all these numbers are made up of fishes, and I realized they actually look like little reefs. And what you see now is part of the outline of reefs on the Great Barrier Reef. And what you see here is actually a section of the Swain's Reef, and every little blue line is the outline of the reef. Currently, that is the only information present for every single reef on the Great Barrier Reef. This is an example of Heron, the reef you've seen previously, where you see the level of detail where science and management has to work with to understand the Great Barrier Reef. Now, there's heaps of very valuable science done based on field data, but that maybe covers 1 to 2% of the whole Great Barrier Reef. Now, satellite images, as we know, cover it on a daily actually on a daily basis as well, but also a 16-day for Landsat and Sentinel every 5 days at different levels of detail for every of the 3,000 reefs. If you compare the Great Barrier Reef, which covers about 345,000 square kilometers, with the coastline of the terrestrial part of Queensland, where Great Barrier Reef is part of, then you realize that Queensland is being mapped on a monthly basis since 1980 in the sense of habitat, and realize there's no equivalent to that detail present, then it's time to get that reef on the map. So that's what the questions we got to basically map the Great Barrier Reef. Here you see the different geomorphic zonations. We first started in the Capricorn Bunker group, and then went to an area called Cairns, 237 reefs. And now we like to go for the whole reef. So in that we use satellite imagery, field data, our knowledge about the environment, the morphology, the benthic ecology, and the relationships between wave climate and specific coral types. Using waves are formed by wind and depth. And so on the moment we had water depth for every image, for every 15-meter pixel of the satellite. We could calculate the wave climate with the help of David Callahan. These data sets, together with slope, gave us an enormous amount of information, which we then use with object-based analysis to form the geomorphic zonation of a reef, using the different attributes like consolidations, water depth, slope, wave height, neighborhood relationships to basically map the different features on the reef, in this case for reef crest. Then we applied the same kind of idea as previously mentioned, but then for every zone. And it worked very well for one reef, but that's only one. So then we went to 20 reefs, and we're able to apply the same approach for 20 reefs in one go. So here you see the geomorphic zonation, and here the benthic composition. And just today, that paper for this work is being published, so I advise you to have a look at it. So that's 20 reefs. There's 2,980 to go. And so we went off to another area on the GBR, which is called Cairns Management Area, the green box, where there's 237 reefs and this little field data that was present that we could use for that approach. There is lots of field data, but not directly suitable. So we went to different areas on the reefs, and you can see here 23 reefs that we visited out of the 237 to get a bit of understanding of those different reefs and how they look like. We used the information for those 3 areas within those 237 reefs to create a rule set based initially on the work of the first part of the talk, and then applied it to the southern part of the reef. You see that here on the right, then on the central part, and then on the northern part. And once all these rule sets seems to work and could be used for all the reefs in all those 3 areas in one go, with the help of Casper Johansen, he created a tiling approach where every reef was applied a rule set. The rule set was applied to every reef on a reef by reef basis. And slowly every single reef was mapped to the level of detail that you could see in the geomorphic and benthic map, as you see here. The same was done with the benthic approach. Once the geomorphic worked, we tried the same way with the benthic. And also there, on a reef by reef basis, the benthic composition was mapped for the 237 reefs. So we used 20 reefs of field data to map 237 reefs. And we're able to map these two types of benthic and eumorphic reefs out of them, using also water depth and in this case Landsat imagery. So summarizing my talk, submerged vegetation is challenged by the changing water column in depth and in color and in texture. Individual reefs, small, large, and various reefs can be mapped successfully with object-based image analysis. And the most common rule sets are using depth, slope, and waves, brightness, but also relationship to neighborhood to get the categories out. I start to call it instead of OBA, because I realized that using the depth, the slope, and the wave, I was also using other data sets to analyze it. The presentation showed that for the first time we were able to map a large number of reefs at full extent at a high level of detail, where you only had a limited amount of field data, and it's unique in the world at this stage. The challenges left are creating seamless images with specifically high resolution imagery for large areas, determining the segment size of natural reef features, because at this moment it's working, but there's not a clear rule for it. The accuracy assessment as discussed previously, and then the large data sets. Landsat imagery for that area was still able to do on a server, but on the moment we would work with other type of high resolution images, then that would be a challenge, and we need to find other ways to do that. And then the other challenge is the endless options, I have to say, that Trimble eCognition has to solve questions. And you see that I use maybe some simple analysis technique, and there are way more complex techniques. So yeah, very exciting to work on this field. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'd like to acknowledge a lot of the people here, and yeah, you can be part of it. So yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming in. One is in terms of processing these large areas, a large expanse of data, multiple scenes. Are you able to do any batch processing with eCognition for this?
Yeah, so that's what Casper Johansson had set up for me, where basically I created a rule set where this process, where I created the rule set initially, and where Casper set up the approach where a tiling process, where every reef is considered a tile, and in a batch background, it's been analyzed for all those reefs.
Okay, so I assume then in that environment you'd be using eCognition server to
Yes.
send the tiles in, and essentially for those of you that I guess are listening unfamiliar with this process, you set up between 100, 1,000, however many jobs you have that I assume were then set up with Casper's tiling technique. They get sent to server, and you just point the images and tell it to reference a specific rule set, and it will run through and grab each one of these and process them one after the other to do that.
Yeah.
Great, great.
Yeah, it's actually not the images, it's actually, in this case, reefs. So it picks, we have created an image mosaic of all those reefs.
Mm-hmm.
And the images are all processed on the same way, so that they really as normalized as possible. And then, so that the rules work very well, of course. And then the procedure is that every reef is extracted from the mosaic, and then the rule set is applied to it.
Right, okay. Yep, so almost using some regional techniques. Excellent.
Yeah.
Another question here is regarding machine learning algorithms. What type of machine learning did you apply here, if any?
No, so I can't talk about it, not because I don't want to, but because I don't know. This is basically with the photo analysis for the photos that are captured in the field. And this large amount for the field trip to the Great Barrier Reef, we collected 50,000 photos, and you don't want somebody to do that manually. So their program is used. You can look it up online. It's made by Oscar Bijboom, called CoralNet, and that helps you analyze the photos. And there's a paper available that describes that process.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be great for the field photos. I think in terms of types of machine learning that's available within eCognition, I can touch upon that briefly here. You have access to various machine learning algorithms, support vector machines, KNN, the decision trees, etc., as well as now deep learning techniques within eCognition. These are all possible classification tools that can be used. Going through some of the other questions that came in, you did spark quite a bit of interest in the community, which is just great. One regarding some of those field data that you collected is they saw you were using video, doing some transects across the reef. Is how would you separate those, say the video that you captured into the testing and training data for the analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we played with that especially with the time series analysis. We played with that a lot from what's the best way to differentiate it, because the accuracy would go really good if you take a field data point for the calibration to train it that falls in the same segment, the training segment, as in the validation segment, of course. So you need to spread it on such a way that you take care there's no overlap and it's really no bias in there. So to do that, we basically, depending on the level of detail we try to map and the segment size, we try to take it so that the number of photos extracted for calibration and validation are lying so apart that they should not fall into the same segment.
Great. Here's one that seems specific to Australia. Is would this approach work with the Geoscience Australia data cube? I guess specifically referencing their Landsat archive.
I think that it would, because as we show here, we do it with Landsat imagery, and ideally I would like to go to Sentinel, or even better to maybe something like Planet Dove. But Sentinel and Landsat is of course freely available, and on the moment you would have more imagery, you actually get more samples, so you get more replicates. So certain characteristics of reefs would be mapped more accurately. So if that data cube could be, now I have to talk of course with a Trimble hat on, could be integrated into eCognition, then I do think that would work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another one came in here is what was the maximum water depth or the depth of that you can map the reefs or even the seagrass at?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, and I get that a lot, and that's why my comments came from. Just think about it. If you go out in a boat and you're at the area you're interested in, and you look over the side of the boat and you can still differentiate features, then you roughly have an idea what can be differentiated from space. Now, I have to say there's some challenges in that, because people say, well, I can see the reef up to 40 meters. And I do agree, there are places in the world where you can see it. But usually what you can map is something dark versus something bright, where you know for the something bright that it's sand, and the something dark, it's coral or algae or dead or rock, so old coral. So you don't know, but I tend to say that the benthic community, to get a good map out, I'm comfortable with 5 to 10 meters water depth, and the geomorphic 15 to 20 meters water depth.
Great. Another question came in regarding the operating environment. Examples you give here are excellent. Do you think this type of method would work in a non-tropical environment?
I think the type of method would work in any environment where the water is clear enough to see the features that you like to map. Does that make sense?
That it makes a lot of sense. And finally, I think this one gives us a good way to wrap up. Is how do you do say a quality assurance, quality control on the data that you are working with?
So the challenge is the different scales we're working with, and so the geomorphic zonation mapping, each geomorphic zone can have a combination of rock, rubble, seagrass, coral, algae. So having a photo in that zone, field photo in that zone, and saying, "Oh, there's so much rock," that doesn't really say if that zone is mapped well. So there we start to come with an approach where you basically use the map itself and the segments of the different categories to be labeled randomly by a person not involved in the mapping to do an assessment of what he thinks is right, because there's not a really good other approach to do that with field data, or that's what we think. With the Bentic community, the field data is basically split in calibration and validation. On top of that, there could be other sources of data. So that could be institutes that collect data that you could help verify areas where you have not been in the field. But it could be also citizen science data, where citizen science projects maybe collect information of the reef. And as long as it has GPS coordinates, you can link it to your image, to your map, and see how good it is.
Great. Just because this one has come in several times, is you've been using satellite imagery mainly because the reefs you're working with are so widespread, and particularly the Great Barrier Reef. But do you think say drone data, UAV data could be used to map very localized reef environments in a similar way that you've done based on the satellite imagery?
Yes, directly. So I work together with Karen Joyce and Javier Leon. They both use drones on the reef, and they both have been going out with us several times to collect field data of the reefs. The advantage of those drone imagery that they give a very high level of detail of a part of the reef. And the way I can see that you could use object-based analysis for that part and use that image that you collect then as kind of a verification set for the whole reef. So you could use, or even training. So I think, yes, you can do that. Your challenge will be that to georeference the field data to that same level of detail that you can see it in the satellite, in the drone imagery. As I mentioned before, the GPS doesn't work underwater, so you have to have some kind of system where the GPS floats at the surface and is exactly on top of you, especially with that high level of detail when you try to map these features. But yeah, I think drone data would be valuable, but I'm also clear at this moment I have not seen an operational approach with drones that could map such large reef systems that I've been working with.
Right, I think that's the challenge with the drones is just getting the flights out to cover such large expanses.
Where the drone data could be of use, very valuable, is of course with ship groundings where there's localized damage, or even assessing parts of reefs that are maybe has a specific impact that you want to study. That could work. But having said that, people ask me, I want to map species of coral. And then again, I say okay, if you're in the boat at the surface and you look with your head in the water without a mask, without a viewing bucket, can you then differentiate those species? And then most people will say, no, I actually can't. And even a lot of scientists, even very well studied scientists, have a hard time to differentiate species of corals underwater. So Bentic community will work, but species level will be hard.
Excellent. Well, I think that wraps up our time here for today. There are other questions, and I will forward along some of these very specific questions to Chris, and he said he's willing to reach out and ask people. You do have his contact information here. You can certainly reach out to him and his team directly with certain questions as to their approach. And please be aware that they've published a number of articles over the years, and also very recently had one published. So there's a lot of material available that covers their methodology. And if you have any questions related to the software that was used or other things regarding eCognition, you can certainly check out the eCognition website, www.ecognition.com, and you can even contact our folks here, certainly in our support channel, support@ecognition.com. We'd also be happy to answer any questions or even pass them on to Chris or people that can answer those. So that brings our webinar to an end today. Thank you very much for attending, and keep in mind we do have our monthly webinar coming up again in March. It will be another topic that goes under the water surface. We'll be looking at seabed habitat mapping and techniques that will be used for that. Our presenter will be Niels Erik Jørgensen from Norway. He has some very interesting things to cover there, looking at a different data set as input, this time looking at sonar and various acoustic input data in this type of environment. So again, thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed the presentation. I find it fascinating, the work you're doing, especially going at such a large scale. Look forward to seeing a complete wall-to-wall map of the Great Barrier Reef, hopefully sometime in the future. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening or rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in the next eCognition webinar.
Yes, thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.